good afternoon. Got a nice video playing here. Welcome to my session. It's an absolute privilege that some of you have chosen to come here, hopefully not just because it was a convenient sitting place close to catering, but if that is why you're here, you're still very welcome. My name's Kat. I'm Director of Education and Research at the Chartered College of Teaching, which is the professional body for the teaching profession. We've got a stand today, so do come and chat to me. It's me manning it. If you want to know anything more about that, I'll talk briefly about us at the end. But what I'm going to be talking about today is this really important question of actually how can we support teacher learning with the ultimate goal that is at the heart of all of our schools of improving pupil outcomes. So I'm going to be talking about the role that school culture plays in that. I can confidently say I have never started a slide deck with an inspirational quote before, so if you could not tweet this, that would be great, because it will completely undermine all of my credibility as someone who's more sarcastic than inspirational. But on this occasion, I actually think that Richard Branson's kind of got it right, and that there's something we can take from this into the education sector. This idea that actually, if you want really high quality experience for your clients, you concentrate on your employees. I think that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that when we're focusing on pupil outcomes and doing the best for our pupils, the biggest difference we can make in schools is by focusing on teacher effectiveness. We know that there are lots of other things that make a difference to pupil outcomes. Prior learning, one of the huge, sort of biggest predictors of pupil attainment, home learning environment, things like that. But actually, in terms of the things that as school leaders, as teachers, as leaders of MATs are in control of, teacher effectiveness is the biggest thing you can make a difference around. And so that's why, for me, it's got to be at the heart of everything that we do in schools, and it's exactly why it's at the heart of everything we do at the Chartered College of Teaching. This was a study done by the Sutton Trust. References and things I've linked at the end of this. There's a link you can go to download all the references and things. But this was a piece of research done by Sutton Trust, which demonstrates that actually this is the biggest thing that we can do in schools. The biggest predictor, the biggest difference to academic outcomes is teacher quality. And one of the really interesting things about that is that this is particularly true for disadvantaged students. A huge focus, of course, around narrowing the gap, and real concerns that possibly that is not really happening in the way that we might hope, the attainment gap between advantaged and disadvantaged pupils. And actually, the difference between outcomes for pupils from a disadvantaged background who are taught by a highly effective teacher is huge compared to those who are taught by an averagely effective teacher or a less effective teacher. So this absolutely is where we have to start. And of course, it's not just that a teacher is effective or more effective, we can help them to get better, and that's where school culture comes in, and that's what we're going to think about. Anyone who's seen me speak before will inevitably have seen me use this slide, and I think this is really, really important. This is for a piece of work in the US. I think it makes a lot of sense. This basically shows how teacher effectiveness increases over time in the classroom. So you've got years along the bottom, and you've got pupil attainment in maths up the side, but this also could be extrapolated out into kind of other subjects and other things as well. Fairly unsurprisingly, we see a massive increase in effectiveness over the first couple of years in the classroom. Of course, when you're learning the trade, it's one of the careers that has the steepest learning curve of any career from that point that you start in the classroom. And then we sort of see after about year 3, sort of flattening out, increasing a bit, definitely a much steeper progression curve. But this piece of work that these researchers, Kraft and Pape, did was trying to understand a bit more detail about that. And what they found was that actually this kind of average curve masks a huge amount of variability, that actually in some schools, some teachers continue to get more effective over time, and in other schools, they really plateau. So this average line is masking a lot of the variance there. And what they were interested in is what is the cause of that difference. And it isn't to do with teachers, it's not to do with the individual teachers on average, it's to do with the environments in which they're working. So they started trying to investigate what makes a strong professional environment where teachers continue to get better, that dark blue line at the top, versus a weaker professional environment, that dotted line at the bottom, because clearly we want to make our environments like the first of those. This is what they found, that teachers who work in more supportive professional environments become more effective at raising student attainment over time than teachers in less supportive environments. Again, I don't think any of this is rocket science, but my role is all about research, so I like to have a bit of research to back up what feels completely like instinct for any of us who've worked in schools. So that's why I think a professional culture is hugely important. First of all, it does help to retain teachers in your school and the system. If we think about that arc, one of the problems we have at the moment is that as teacher retention becomes worse and worse, people are leaving earlier and earlier in their careers, so they're never getting to the point that they're highly effective practitioners, which is kind of a vicious circle, because one of the reasons teachers leave is they feel like they're not doing a good enough job, they find it too hard, and so they leave, and then we don't have all that effectiveness and expertise in the system. So there's a kind of starting point there of just we need to retain teachers, and a strong professional environment is a really good way of retaining teachers in the system. It also is a way of helping teachers to keep developing their practice to get more and more effective, and ultimately that takes us to this point where we're improving outcomes for children and young people our teachers are working with. And this applies across all settings. So these are the things that Kraft and Pape found were indicative of a strong professional environment. It's worth saying this wasn't a randomized controlled trial. They didn't have schools who weren't doing this and see what's the difference if you introduce consistently enforced rules, but they looked and they saw that consistently these were the things in place in the schools where teachers continued to get more and more effective over time. Consistently enforced rules around behaviour, time and resources for professional development, trust, respect and open culture, a commitment to student achievement, opportunities for collaboration, and any teacher evaluation that takes place being focused on improving the quality of teaching. So performance management processes all being about being developmental, being about supporting and improving quality of teaching and nothing else. Another interesting piece of work that focused on the UK, because that piece of work was in US schools. Of course, there are differences, but there's also a reasonable amount of similarity. Sam Sims looked at TALIS data to understand what gives teachers higher levels of job satisfaction. So he wasn't looking at effectiveness, but if we make that connection that teachers retained in the profession are going to be more effective over time, this is important. Really similar list of things there. We're going to touch on workload in a moment, but the things that were a bit different were this sense of opportunities for progression, so feeling that actually they could progress in a career pathway, and a manageable workload, which, as I said, we'll mention briefly. I spent a bit of time trying to not just have these as a kind of bullet-pointed list, but think about how these things relate, and to look deeper into some of the research about the relationships that exist. And this is the first time I've used this presentation, so if it's terrible, please tell me, and if it's useful, also please tell me, but hopefully this represents something that feels quite reflective of the environments that you're working in. So I was trying to kind of understand the logic model, the link, the process between this strong professional environment, all of the things that we know exist in a strong professional environment, and these improved pupil outcomes. The behaviour policies one is in some ways the most interesting because it's the one that's sort of least related to the teachers. And of course, what seems to be the case there is that if teachers are spending all of their time worrying about managing behaviour, they are not concentrating on developing their practice. It adds workload, it takes time, and it makes them less satisfied and less confident about their own effectiveness if they're feeling that they aren't able to control the behaviours in their classroom. Interestingly, the researchers weren't looking at specifically what the behaviour policies were. They're not saying that one particular type, a zero tolerance or a sort of restorative justice approach is better than any other. They were just looking at the fact that in these schools, the behaviour policies were very clear and very consistently applied by all teachers, so that pupils are very clear of expectations, teachers are very clear of consequences, and those things were all followed through. So in a way, that kind of, for me, sits as a kind of a base point that actually, if you haven't got that right, so much of teachers' time is spent worrying about that they are ultimately not going to be delivering high-quality teaching, and they're not going to be developing their own practice. The second one was this point of trust and autonomy, that actually this is so important that teachers feel that they are trusted to do a good job, that they don't feel like there's excessive monitoring taking place. That links through to this workload point as well, that where we tend to see workload is higher in schools, it's often because of excessive monitoring and things like that. The workload point has a really interesting nuance. The work that Sam Sims did looked at some questions around number of hours worked. And interestingly, when teachers were asked about how manageable they felt their workload was and how satisfied they were and how many hours they worked, teachers weren't less satisfied when they said they worked more hours. It was related entirely to how manageable they felt the workload was. So whether they felt that they had the resources they needed to do it, it isn't just a question of how many hours a week you work. And the other thing that seems to come across from more qualitative research is that it's also about how worthwhile the work that you're doing feels. That we hear time and time again from teachers, they go into the job because they want to make a difference for children and young people. I don't think anyone could ever accuse teachers of being work shy, but what they want to know is that the time that they're spending is genuinely making a difference. The concern comes when they're being asked to do things that are not making any difference for pupils, but are perhaps because people think it's what Ofsted wants and that sometimes is reflected in a school culture and concerns around that, which links really nicely into this third point. Commitment to student achievement seemed to me like quite a kind of vague, overarching idea, but I think what's critical here is that this is sitting at the heart of everything that a school does, that when they're thinking about making decisions about policies, when they're thinking about what they prioritise, it's all about student achievement, not things like Ofsted or external monitoring or anything else, that they're really focusing on the best possible thing that they can do for student achievement. So this, for me, is the kind of base layer that we have to have before we start to worry about everything else. This is the core of a school's culture, or a maths culture, and we'll talk about the kind of wider system level later. Then layered on top of this is the idea that teachers do need to have access to professional learning. That's no surprise to anyone. We are seeing, with the challenges that schools have around school budgets, of course we are seeing, to some extent, schools choosing to cut spend on professional learning. But we're also seeing, interestingly, a lot more flexibility and recognition of the range of different kinds of professional learning that can make a difference for teachers. It's not all about one-off expensive days or courses. There are lots of different ways that we can support teachers develop through things like coaching, which might be a model that you deliver in-house, things like journal clubs where teachers engage together in groups. Again, those collaborative in-house models can be really powerful, with the one caveat that there is a risk there that sometimes, Dylan William talks about this a bit, if you have a group of teachers who work together, it can be quite easy to continue to just sort of embed practices that are already there. It's quite important to make sure you're bringing in some sort of external challenge as well, which might be in the form of a person, but it also might be in the form of a piece of reading that challenges the ways that you do things. And that's really important. So professional learning has to be there for teachers to be satisfied and to be effective. We know that not all professional learning makes a difference. Actually, in some ways, it's a bit depressing when you look about how much professional learning can be shown to have made an impact on pupil attainment, but there are models that are making a difference for sure. The second point is this idea of developmental teacher evaluation. If you look at things like performance-related pay, that's one of the strands on the EEF toolkit. Really limited evidence that that's doing anything useful at all for teacher effectiveness. We're seeing increasing numbers of schools and trusts moving towards a model where actually any performance management process is much more focused on teachers' engagement in professional learning in the way in which they're committed to developing, rather than attempting to kind of judge them based on lesson observations or anything else, that it's all about their professional learning and growth, which again, it's unsurprising that that is leading to greater teacher satisfaction. And the third one, which is so important, is this time for collaboration. And this can be one of the hardest things as a teacher, I think. It's a weird job where you kind of have 30 eyes on you all day long, and you can guarantee that as soon as you say something stupid or trip over or drop something or spill something on yourself, those kids will have noticed it. But it can also feel slightly isolated because you're apart from adults for a lot of the day. You know, we have perhaps some time at break time, lunchtime, after school, but those times tend to be quite pressured, quite limited. There's 1,000,001 things to do. You might be running clubs, you've got meetings. Making that time for really powerful collaboration is quite hard. There are some interesting questions there about how we can design into school layouts opportunities for that. Interesting, not been any kind of robust research on this yet, but the impact of some schools are moving away from having staff rooms, and does that actually reduce these opportunities for informal collaboration, the sort of water cooler moments that used to be powerful. But there is very clear evidence that opportunities to collaborate not just make teachers more satisfied, but seem to be related to their effectiveness. There was a fascinating piece of research, again in the US, where a lot more of these kind of large-scale pieces of research have been done, by James Spillane and colleagues, who looked at this notion of kind of teacher effectiveness, how teachers think of as who is the most effective in their school, and how conversations work. And they had expected that the teachers who were most effective based on their pupil outcomes, the kind of value added for their pupils, would be the ones that other people approached most to ask for advice. They thought teachers will know who's most effective in their school. If they want to know how to do something better, they'll go to that teacher. They found that actually that didn't seem to be the case at all. It was almost the opposite. The ones who were most effective were the ones who spent most time going and asking other people for advice. So you were much more likely, again, it's not a randomized controlled trial, it is just correlation, but you were much more likely to be a highly effective teacher if you were someone who spent a lot of time going and asking and engaging with others for support and reflecting and developing, which I think is really interesting. And I think if we've got these kind of 3 opportunities in place, we then start to see 4 related areas come together. The first of those is job satisfaction, which I've touched on this. This is absolutely critical. If you want someone to stay in the profession, you need them to be satisfied with their jobs. There's all sorts of things that we can see that the reasons that teachers leave tend to be, they quite often take a lower paid job It's not that they're going into another sector because they're going to be better paid, but they go into a job where they feel they have better job satisfaction and lower workloads relative to their amount of pay. So we really need to think about teacher job satisfaction and all of the things that we know feed into that. Job satisfaction and retention very closely aligned. Obviously, you're much more likely to stay in the profession if you have increased job satisfaction. And as we've seen through that chart, over time you become more effective. So retention is in itself linked into teachers' own effectiveness, which comes into a kind of fourth layer that I think is really important, which is this notion of self-efficacy, how much you believe that you're doing a good job. There's an interesting relationship between self-efficacy and effectiveness. Generally, the teachers who are most effective consider themselves to be most effective. They have most confidence in their own ability. Again, it's not a question of that being an RCT to say, if you're more effective, you will believe this, but those things are aligned, and it seems to be a two-way relationship, that actually, if you have confidence in the decisions that you're making, you become more effective as a practitioner, and when you know that you're more effective as a practitioner, you're confident, and so that's a kind of, really these arrows could go in every direction, but obviously it's also fair to assume that when we think about people coming into the profession, as I said, because they want to make a difference, they think that they'll be good at it, that's very high up the list on things like LKMCO's Why Teach report. I think I'll be good at teaching, that's why I go into it. And if you then feel that you're not good at teaching, you're likely to be less satisfied. If they're more effective, they have greater self-efficacy, they'll then be more satisfied with their roles. And this all links back round into this kind of virtuous circle, and these arrows could go in every direction here. But that's thinking about individual teacher level. What's also quite interesting is how that, sorry, it's got a bit bright colours here, but I was obviously feeling particularly bright when I was making this. That's about individuals, but there's also some really interesting research about how an individual teacher's expertise, effectiveness, satisfaction, and everything else sits within the context of their department and within their school. There's two particular points I'd like to pick up on here. The first one of those is that self-efficacy, this confidence in your own effectiveness, is very much collective, not individual. If you work in a department where your colleagues feel confident, if you work in a school where you feel that you're making a difference to pupil outcomes, you will feel more confident about your own practice. But the effectiveness point is really important too. A researcher, Kirabo Jackson, looked at this question of whether teachers get better when they work alongside more effective colleagues, and they absolutely do. If you are, particularly if you're an early career teacher, and you work in a department or a year group where you have more effective colleagues around you, you will progress, you will become more effective. And that doesn't only exist for the time that you're in that school, that exists across your whole career. You go somewhere else, if you have been working with really highly effective colleagues, that will continue to be the case. So again, you've got this collective effectiveness of your school and the collective self-efficacy. And that, I think, is how we get to improved pupil outcomes. So that's my kind of principal logic model for this. I mentioned that I've been talking a lot there about the school as the kind of sort of unit of interest, but these things, schools don't exist in isolation. Many are part of multi-academy trusts. Even standalone schools often exist in partnerships in their region. And those MATs, those individual schools, also exist within a wider education system. And one of the things that we know is that it's very difficult for schools to create these kinds of cultures if they exist in a system where these cultures are not encouraged. So there's a huge amount to do at a system level as well to ensure that actually when we think about accountability systems, when we think about opportunities for teacher career progression, there are things that are supporting all the things we know. Really interesting work from the DFE at the moment around things like specialist MPQs to create new career pathways and training that aren't focused on leadership. Things like the early career framework, which focuses on mentoring and coaching and development for teachers early in their career. And that's absolutely also where we see ourselves at the Chartered College of Teaching sitting, that we're part of both giving teachers access to individual professional learning and support and collaboration opportunities, supporting schools to create those kinds of cultures, and ultimately creating a system that has this idea of professionalism, of trust, of autonomy, of professional learning, of collaboration absolutely at its heart. So I'm just going to wrap up by just talking very briefly about some of the things that we do. Hopefully some of you are members already, but if you're not, it would be brilliant if you wanted to consider joining or to encourage colleagues to. It's £45 a year to join, half price for NQTs. You can pay monthly as well. And we do have a number of schools who pay for their staff and recognise the value of this. If you're a member, you get a termly copy of our journal that's themed. We've had issues around school culture itself. We've had issues around the science of learning, around curriculum design. And we normally do one special issue a year as well, which focuses on particular areas of sort of policy interest or changes in practice that are particularly relevant for schools. We have an online platform with hundreds of articles contributed by teachers and academics, research summaries. We have events that we hold nationally by working with schools to run very low-cost, free or even free regional events. We have forums and consultations that allow you to feed into government work. I've been privileged enough to be on 3 government advisory groups in the last year, and all of those I'm feeding in what I'm hearing from members and from fellows. And we also offer, additionally to our core membership, a chartered teacher program, which, I'm going to come back to that, which is all about recognising teachers who want to develop and are ambitious, but want to focus on their classroom practice, not these traditional leadership routes. It's an advanced teacher certification that gives you chartered teacher status when you complete it. It takes 15 months to do. It's certainly rigorous. We're into halfway through the second cohort now, and the pilot cohort have all said it's been some of the best development they've ever done, but that it is hard. They do written exams and everything. They also do a research project. Very happy to chat to anyone about that. The other thing I wanted to highlight, which came out just on Friday, is we've just published a new, completely free for everyone, report on trends, opportunities and challenges in teacher CPD internationally. It has contributions from people like Rob Coe, from Dylan William, from various others. It's 196 pages long. It's a bit bigger than I expected when we started working on it. But you can find, if you look us up on Twitter, or you can find that on our website to download. I've mentioned this already. We're all about creating that kind of culture in a system that supports the professional culture we need for teachers to thrive, to ultimately make a difference for pupil outcomes. One thing that you can look at, you might want to take a photo of this if you want to. I put together a whole reading list of some of the most interesting research, blogs, articles from TES, articles from Schools Week, publications of our own around this idea of building a strong professional culture. And I've put those all together in a reading list that you can access using that link. There's lots in there. It touches on things like actually behaviour systems across schools, as well as these ideas around professional learning, so you might find that useful, and that obviously also contains the references that I've mentioned during my slides. And as I said, I'll be around for the rest of the day over on my stand, which is somewhere over there, and I'd love to chat to any of you who want to do so. And that's me perfectly on time with no time for questions. But again, if you want to grab me after, that would be a pleasure. Thank you very much.